those of you who don't know BGIS, and it's semi-relevant to what I'm going to take you through quickly, we're a services company. We manage a whole lot of properties, facility managers across the country, and so we've literally got hundreds of thousands of properties that we're responsible for. And maybe a bit different than some of the product-led discussions that we've heard this morning, we're a services company who sees that there's disruption very close in our future. So what I'm going to talk about today is, in coming to that view on the future of our industry, we've realized that we need to be a lot better at collecting and organizing data, because it is going to be the fuel for us going forward, where in the past we've been able to manage these buildings through the real smarts and experience of really good people, but we didn't necessarily have the data that came off the back of a lot of that. So that's all changing very quickly for us. So a lot of you probably sort of know the escalation of data, but just to put it in perspective, right back in the mid-90s, Toshiba invented the USB. Big revolution, sort of a change from floppy disks. I don't know how many of you remember floppy disks, but Toshiba came up with this, and in 2001, late 2000, 2001, IBM commercialized the first what was called the thumb drive back then. And for context, that was an 8 megabyte thumb drive. And this was, for a lot of us who lived before that, this was a huge step. I mean, to give you context, I sent this PowerPoint to Hargraves yesterday or the day before, and it's a 14 megabyte file, right? So it's a pretty, but this at the time could hold fountains of information. It was a tremendous sort of step forward. If we zoom forward to 2020, the forecast is, and we're well on that track, and I'm sort of comparing apples and oranges here, but you'll get the sense, that for data, there will be 100 megabits of data every minute produced for every person on Earth. So we've gone from, what was a big sort of sense back in 2000 to 20 years later, and only a couple of years from now, just a massive up-ramp in data. And the scarier part going forward is if we project the forecast of data over the next 20 years, the same as it's been in the last 20 years, which is really an exponential growth curve, following the exponential growth curve that technology has followed. The data contribution, or the amount of data we'll be dealing with, is 1 million plus times more than we have today, right? There's other stats about we've produced more data in the last 2 years than we have in the history of the Earth, right? So this is a phenomenally exponential growth curve that data is following. We, as a facility services business, this is our data environment, right? So we have hundreds of thousands of assets around this country and New Zealand, from an unmanned telco repeater site to 100,000 square meter office facilities that we manage. And within the average data points in each of those buildings is on average between 4,000 and 6,000 data points in each of those buildings. So you start to do the math of 4,000 times hundreds of thousands is a whole lot of data that's sitting on a curve that's about to sort of go up even more. Because as people walk in our buildings with a phone, or as people register at our sites on a contractor management system, or as assets in our buildings become linked to the internet through either the replacement of those assets or sensors from an Internet of Things perspective to measure their temperature or their humidity or their vibration, all of those data sets are suddenly being created. And what we've realized, I guess, in the last year is that we weren't in a position to collect that data in a way that was going to make it as useful as we can forecast for us in the future. And so we've gone through an exercise that we're partway through now. And this presentation is more about sharing that exercise with you as to where we are and what our learnings are to date. So the part that we have focused on out of our environment, because to focus on it all was probably the great big overwhelming component of how do we start this, how do we eat the elephant? So we've focused on something that our customers are telling us and that we know, because we're contracted to a lot of it going forward, is the data around the assets that exist in each of these buildings, especially the critical assets. Because in many cases, if those assets fail, it creates problems for our customers. And so we're responsible for that not happening. Our data strategy. I'm going to go through a few points here that really just take us through how we got to a strategy point. And the first thing was to define what valuable looked like. So with customer input, with input from our contracts, with input from our team, we've tried to forecast out a number of years as to what do we want to learn from the data, because that impacts what data we need and the form that we're going to collect it in. We needed to establish our data architecture. So back in the database, we use an ERP system called Manhattan, but it could be anywhere. We've had to figure out what data goes into what boxes. Because at the end of the day, if we've got a whole bunch of people and service providers, and we're a global organization, so this sort of extends even beyond here, but if we're collecting it in different ways, it's going to be far less valuable to us than if we've had a consistent architecture for collecting that data. Terminology is also key, right? So what somebody might call an air handling unit, somebody else might call an HVAC unit. And if those two units are equivalent, but you've captured them differently from an architecture or a data dictionary perspective, then they're not going to be informing us the same way that they could. And we've literally got thousands and thousands of different types and typologies of assets. Determine the methods for collecting these. Again, at the scale that we're talking about, we can't just create this and go ask our teams to go collect the data. In many cases, we get it from clients in one shape or another. We get it from a competitor of ours who might have done some collection, or we get it from subcontractors who we've hired to go out and collect or update that data. So the sources of people making these collections is very diverse. And so having them understand how we want it back and in what form and so that it's going to be most valuable to us has been a key part. So this whole strategy is linked back to our procurement team to inform our subcontractor base, to re-engineer our contracts so that we're in a position to get what we want at the end of the day. We've then had to educate, and this is the process we're in now, educate everybody in the process. How do we want it collected? What do we want it called? There's also variables in our data set, as I assume that there are in many, where it's not black and white. There's a subjective component as to what is the quality of that asset. Is it really great, or is it about to fail, or is it somewhere in between? And so teaching that subjectivity as to how we would like that subjective decision to be made, providing photos, providing examples, providing case studies, is part of the training in the hopes that if we've got 1,000 people around the country making that same assessment, that as many times as possible, their assessments are reasonably consistent. Or suddenly, our data set is, questionable. And finally, really build checks and filters into the whole process to screen out bad data. Inevitably, given the volumes that we're dealing with, given the hands that are touching the data before it gets into our data set, there's a huge amount of room for error, and there always will be. So what we want to do is have a check and balance before that time. So we've set up a team who screen that data, and they're part of the process now of re-educating them as to what are they looking for, what are the checks and balances, how do we automate some of those tools and write macros to test some of the data before it goes in to the data set. Because once it's there, let's be honest, there's so much more coming, and we've got so much to do. Chances of going back and cleaning up that data, though I know it happens and there's more and more programs and businesses that look to do that, it's an awful hard exercise when you're still just trying to keep up with that curve of new data that you're trying to keep up with. So from a key learnings perspective on this, scrutinize what's going to be valuable. Really, one of our hardest decisions, or one of the biggest decisions we had to make as a business, was how much of this data is really going to be valuable to us. And I'll give you an example, which may not be that important to you, but right on this floor, there will be fire exits. There will be fire sprinkler systems. There will be fire extinguishers. And so on this floor of this building alone, there will be probably upwards of 100 assets that need to be checked annually, that need to be validated, that need to form part of the compliance that this floor is occupiable. Right? So our decision had to come down, do we treat this as a floor, or do we go down to the asset and identify every one of the exit signs within that database? And I'm sure you don't care where we ended up, but it was decisions like that that needed to be made, because the problem with data, especially when you look at the future of data, is too much is not necessarily a good thing. What you really want to have is the right amount, and that comes to that bet you're going to make as you go through as to where's the value, what's the value I'm going to get out of this data, and how can I interpret what I've collected to bring value back to my customer or back to the business. Consider industry standards. This also entered into this exercise about halfway through, which was the industry, our industry, which is really probably playing catch-up in many ways, and given the fact that it's about to be disrupted, has started to create industry standards. And so we had to incorporate industry standards or consider them in the context of our own data architecture so that we could determine if it was going to be worthwhile to benchmark outside of our own business. And so we looked at where they were up to, and we've considered our own sort of position, and we've made choices around the data architecture, the terminology, all of the things that are going to impact our ability to manage or compare our data set against industry standards. So for all of you, there may be industry standards that form part of that data strategy. Automate the process wherever you can. I mean, I guess it goes unsaid, but you've really got to sort of design the process in the first case, the architecture, the terminology, the dictionary. But once you get to a point where you start to understand what it is that you're creating, the ability to automate, and I gave the example earlier about creating the macros to go in and scrutinize a lot of the data as part of a filter before it enters the system. And I'm sure going forward there will be more and more opportunities with innovation and new companies to help us to do that, because data, as I'm sure all of you know, is really the fuel of the 21st century, right? And it's going to be a key part of, I think, everything that we do going forward. And I have no doubt there will be all sorts of options that come forward for how we are smarter about it, how we manage it better. And I guess the last piece was really just to start. Listen, I consider myself to be pretty good at problem solving, and this was one of the things where I would go home at night and I honestly didn't know where to start. It was such a big problem. It was such a big opportunity in many ways, but it could be very overwhelming. And different customers, different people in the business had quite different views on what was important and what wasn't important, and where we needed to start, and how important was data we'd collected in the past, but in a very unstructured or disorganized way. And yeah, we finally sort of just boiled it down and chose a piece. And granted, it's a big piece, but it's an important piece for us on the asset side. We've chosen a piece, and I'm sure this will become part of a journey as we become better at it. To add other information, so, customer information as they enter and exit our buildings, and buyer data from our shopping centers and various places like that. But first things first, we wanted to focus on the critical environment, the assets that operate these buildings for us. And we're partway through that now, and it's been very interesting. I don't know if it applies to all of you yet, or if you're farther along the curve, but that's sort of our journey so far. So.